Well, Gold Derby fans, I am very excited to be sitting down with a six-time Emmy Award-winning music editor. He is back this year with two sound editing nominations for his work on Stranger Things and American Horror Story 1984. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby. With me is David Klotz. Congrats on those double nominations, David.
Thank you.
You know, I kind of want to just dive right into the never-ending story because it was one of the most delightfully unexpected moments, I think, of this third season of Stranger Things, when suddenly they break out into this giant musical moment. And you actually produced and arranged that
That's
cover
right,
of
yeah.
the song. So did you kind of come in, it's obviously an 80s classic, did you come in with an idea already of how you wanted that to sound? How did that play out?
No, not at all. Actually, that was sort of an accident. The way my role came into it because they had already shot it on set. Because as a music editor, I kind of joined the crew sort of in post production. So they've already kind of filmed a bunch of stuff by the time we're brought in. And I was, I think, working well into episode 2 or 3 when the picture editor, Dean Zimmerman, had called me and said, "Hey, we're sending you the scene for the last episode. Check it out. We need help trying to figure out how we're going to, the plan they wanted to try, from what I understand, is they shot the kids singing live on the set. And they wanted to have the original, the original Neverending Story recording by Lamal from the 80s. They wanted it to play along with them. But it was a struggle because the kids were singing. The tempo was going up and down, and then they were out of key sometimes from the other. So I threw my hands in the air. I was like, "What are we going to do? This is not going to work." And I just thought for sure, like, oh, this is just going to have to be a acapella. It is what it is. But we figured out a way. I figured out a way where we can cut the picture and do a few things with Dean, the picture editor, where we can get him into at least a tempo. And from that point, then maybe we can find someone to do a re-recording. And the plan was maybe to get our amazing composers, Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein, to get involved. But they were, at the time, just swamped just trying to write the score for the rest of the season. So this sort of lingered on for a while. And then, I just thought, like, well, I have all these things here. I even own some of the same gear that Giorgio Moroder had when they recorded the original. So I'm like, well, this could be fun. This will be a fun project. So I just started working on a synth arrangement that was sort of, faithful to the original, but had sort of a little bit of a nod to kind of the sound of the show. And the Duffer Brothers dug it. And, it was a real challenge to make happen. And I'm so glad that we got nominated for that episode just for the challenge putting that together, because it turned out great, I think.
It did. It was one of them, it's great to have this sudden moment of like 80s nostalgia and comedy in the middle of maybe the most intense moment of the show.
Monster chase.
Yeah. And I was wondering, because, Giorgio Moroder's pretty big shoes to fill for a producer there. Do you often find that you use kind of 80s era synths to make your music, or do you have to use that kind of equipment on the show to match the sound?
Well, the composers, Kyle and Michael, do. I mean, they really mine a lot of the original sounds using a lot of hardware, and I think, but they also use it in a way that's not just 80s sounding. They have kind of cool ways of making it sound darker and for the show. And yeah, I think it's important to not to try to avoid computer instrument plugins. In general, when you're playing synth stuff, just if you have the time and the luxury to mess around with that stuff, I think it sounds better. You get more of a original sound, and you're not just like hitting a button and knowing that anyone out there who can buy the same soft synth can do the same thing.
Right. Is it sort of normal for you? I'm wondering what your kind of collaboration process is usually like with other departments. Is it a normal scenario to bring in an editor like Dean onto the scene and work together that way, or what is that process like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in the whole the music department, as a music editor, I'm the one sort of working the closest with the picture department. They're the ones constantly calling me to figure out how we're going to make a certain piece of music work. Yeah, I mean, I'm almost like the liaison to the composer sometimes, in that regard. So yeah, I think it's yeah, that's part of the music editor's job. You're almost like just as much a part of the film editing team as you are the sort of music and sound team as well.
I actually talked to Dean earlier this season, and we were talking about when, you know, making the choice of when to cut, and the music in this show has, you know, is so important to the show because there's so much nostalgia for the 80s baked into that. But I'm wondering, is the choice of when to use music a difficult one? You know, is it difficult to decide when that happens or when there should be silence?
Yeah, and it's. I think it's also an easy trap to want to always put music in scenes, and I think the real challenge is to, you know, I feel like I'm almost advocating more often than not to take music out of a scene than to put music in. And it's like goes against like everything that, you know, that I'm supposed to be doing. But I feel like it's just as effective to find, you know, you really have to identify the places where music should start and stop. And I think those could be really important in helping, you know, helping tell the story better.
Yeah. And you're on quite an 80s kick this year, because you're also nominated for American Horror Story 1984. And that one has such a really tongue-in-cheek tone to it, and tongue-in-cheek tone to the 80s. How does that tone affect the way you're approaching your role?
Yeah, that's different in a way. Yeah, I think Mac Quayle, the composer on that show, really found a great way of capturing the humor and the feel of the 80s, and also, you know, I think he had the biggest challenge of all, because he had to that was he was using that world of instruments and sounds, but he still had to cover the same bases that you need to do in American Horror Story, which is like, you got to have some shit scary moments and some, you know, terrifying stings and things. But, you know, he was doing it with an 80s palette.
Yeah.
And he pulled it off really well. And I think that was one of the, I loved working on, that was my favorite American Horror Story to work on, the music.
The music's very prominent in it.
Yeah, it was really hard too, because with all the synth stuff, there's always this tempo, like, you know, arpeggios, and you hear the filters opening up on these keyboards, and so it was really hard to find ways to chop them down. So I'm glad we got recognized for that show. That was a tough one to edit too.
Yeah. Did you go back to sort of classic 80s slasher films for inspiration? Because there is sort of when you think of those films, there is a way that music is often built and is inserted into scenes.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's interesting, because even with Stranger Things, I started going back and listening to a lot of horror scores that I found inspirational. And I discovered a lot more that I thought, you know, they kind of fell through the cracks, like John Harrison. I think it's John Harrison, The Day of the Dead. And I just loved discovering all these, you know, old 80s things that, you know, aren't the typical, like, you know, everybody knows Carpenter and that kind of thing. So yeah, I did a little bit of a dive on some obscure, and we even used some of that stuff. And actually, Stranger Things, we used some score from Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Yeah.
What a great reference.
Yeah,
yeah,
I know.
And you know, for American Horror Story, you've worked with Ryan Murphy on, it seems like, most of his shows. You've been there for Glee, for Pose, Feud, Hollywood. I'm very excited about the upcoming Ratchet on Netflix.
Yeah. Another great score from Mac Quayle, by the way.
Yeah.
He did a fantastic job on that.
When you kind of have that ongoing relationship and you've worked on so many of his shows before, does that help you in a way? Does that key you in more to what he's looking for and what type of tone needs to be had?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I feel like I'm sort of part of the team, and it's like, I sort of work with the same producers, the same kind of pool of editors that they go through. And I feel like sometimes there's a shorthand um, where I know I just know what they're going to want, and for specific moments. And whether it's something I'm cutting, or if I'm looking for a piece of temp score, um, or if they're like, can you find a song for this spot? Like, I feel like I've been working with the same crew for a while to have a good, yeah, I think shorthand is the good term. It's just, I mean, we don't even have spotting sessions. We just like get right into it, and they'll send me a cut with where they want to have music, and
Yeah.
we figure it out.
And you've, in the midst of all the Ryan Murphy shows too, you've worked on some of these series that have become these pop culture phenomenons, from Stranger Things, American Horror Story, Game of Thrones, which you've won for before, and one of my personal favorites, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which you've even done the series finale of that.
Yeah.
So what is it like seeing your work be so widely consumed in that way?
I love it. It's great. I like working on stuff that people have heard of, and would call me up and say, "Hey, I saw this. I saw that you worked on it." It's meaningful. Buffy the Vampire Slayer that you mentioned, it was like, that was like my first TV gig, and it was the last season of Buffy, and so I was already aware of how good the show was, and how great the writing was, and how talented Joss Whedon was, and in every way. And then and I even saw all of that in the last season. Like the music was great, and so I feel like I was sort of spoiled, like right out of the gate. Like I thought, like, is everything I'm going to work on be this good? And it wasn't for a while. But I was able to recognize that early on. I feel sometimes, though, it's, I do try to, if I'm offered something, I try to make choices if I can. But then I've also fallen into the mantra of, like, say yes to everything, because you never know when your next job's going to be, or how long you're going to be without work. So, I've done a few things. And, I mean, Game of Thrones is an example where Ramin had called me, the composer, and said, "Hey," and it was sort of a last minute, like, "Hey, we're doing this. I got this show." I guess they fired the first composer they had on it. And Ramin was called in at the last minute, and it was like, "I'm doing the show. Do you want to do it with me? We're starting tomorrow. Can you be in Santa Monica at like 10 a.m. for a spotting session?" And I was like, what is this? And I just Googled Game of Thrones, like wondering like what this show was. And I read like a, quick log line, and I was just like, what is this Dungeons and Dragons bullshit? This is so not my cup of tea. And, but I was like, I'm glad I was going with the say yes to everything, dogma at the time. And I said yes, and I went and met Ramin, and I met David Benioff and Dan Weiss and Carolyn Strauss all there that day. And we watched the first couple episodes, and I was like, yeah, this might be pretty good. So,
Yeah. Well,
it's luck.
Yeah. That one you had great Emmy success with. Well, many of us Emmy watchers lament that Buffy the Vampire Slayer did not do better than it did over the course of its run with that awards body. But last year, you have a very impressive Emmy streak. You have 6 wins. Last year, you won for Game of Thrones, which was your 6th win. And that year was a solo nomination, but every other year since 2012, you've been nominated for 2 Emmys. You've had double nominations and often win one. So what does it feel like to just continually be invited back to the party each year?
I love it. I do not take any of this for granted. I appreciate it every year. So I don't, I know this streak's going to run out. So I'm just enjoying it while it lasts. I think next year might be probably the first year where I don't think I'm, because of COVID and everything, I'm not working on anything that's that prominent that might, end up there next year. So it's sad this year with the awards where we're doing them virtually. And so I won't be able to see all my peers and colleagues and at the parties. And, I love it. It's such a fun thing to do. And I like going to the events and seeing friends and talking about what we do and celebrating the work we do.
Well, it's excellent work on Stranger Things and American Horror Story this season. And
Thank you.
everyone who's out there watching, make sure you subscribe to Gold Derby and keep in touch with us. We have lots more interviews just like this one with other nominees. And David, thank you so much. Best of luck at the Emmys.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.